Good evening, everybody. Good evening. My name's Oliver Brain. I'm the Dean of Leeds School of Art. And it gives me great pleasure this evening to welcome you here to Leeds Beckett University and our professorial inaugural lecture of Kiff Bamford, Professor of Art and Philosophy at Leeds School of Arts. Kiff has published widely on the work of French philosopher Jean-François Lyotard, with a focus on the interrelationship between art, performance, and philosophy. Kiff studied for a BA in Fine Art at Winchester School of Art, a PGCHE at Huddersfield University, and an MA in Art History and Visual Culture at Goldsmiths College, London, before being awarded an Arts and Humanities Research Council studentship to undertake a PhD at the University of Manchester. The resulting research was published as the monograph titled Lyotard and the Figural in Performance, Art and Writing, which was published by Continuum in 2012 and Bloomsbury in 2013. Further publications of Kiff's include Jean-François Lyotard Critical Lives, published by Reaction in 2017, the collection Jean-François Lyotard, The Interviews and Debates, published by Bloomsbury in 2020, and the first English translation of Lyotard's Lectures d'Enfance, co-edited with Professor Robert Harvey under the title Readings in Infancy, published by Bloomsbury in 2023, and the collected volume Lyotard and Critical Practice, co-edited with Margaret Grebowicz by Bloomsbury in 2023. Kiff is now working on a second volume of Jean-François Lyotard, The Interviews and Debates, and a project with Peter W. Milne researching the proximities, connections, and differences between Lyotard and Jacques Derrida. It's a real privilege for me to introduce the inaugural lecture this evening, not just because of that great body of work that I've only just scratched the surface of, but also because Kiff is a very important and special part of the Leeds School of Arts community. And a couple of colleagues only this week were commenting on his strengths and what a great colleague he is. The first of which saying that he seemingly finds it utterly impossible to do anything badly. Another commenting that he has an extraordinary eye for detail. And another saying he's just a great big brain. This lecture is part of Leeds Beckett University's inaugural professorial lecture series. Following the lecture, there won't be Q&A in here, but if you would like to discuss anything that you've heard of Kiff's, please do that informally over refreshments downstairs, which are available for you. So now it is my pleasure to invite Professor Kiff Bamford to present his professorial inaugural lecture, Jean-François Lyotard for Beginners, inopportune, unseemly, and even disquieting. Thank you.
Cool, that's really nice. Look, I even had a slide, especially for you, Oliver. Thank you very much, Oliver, for that introduction, and thank you all for being here. It's an absolute pleasure to see so many of you here tonight. This lecture's in 3 parts. I'm holding up my fingers just in case you're not sure what 3 means. The first one is thank yous. The second one, which is the main event, is about Lyotard, because as you've heard, it's somewhat an obsession of mine. That's in 5 parts. And have you got your computational? Yeah. So the first part is thank yous. The second part is Lyotard, that's in 5 sections. The third part is quite short and a bit different. Okay. But I do want to start quite seriously with some thank yous. Because I want to recognise and celebrate the collaborations and webs of which we are a part and from which things emerge. I am proud to work at a former polytechnic, a polytechnic that opened its doors in 1970. A polytechnic that was founded on the promotion of technical and vocational skills and widening higher education. Polytechnicity values plurality, cross-pollination, and doing as thinking. And I'm going to come back to this idea of polytechnicity later in relation to Lyotard. We are in different cultural, political and economic, a different cultural, political and economic climate than in 1970. But it does please me that I have been promoted to professor despite the fact that I'm very unlikely to bring in large research grants. And I'm pleased that, as yet, not everything is reduced to a cost-benefit analysis. I'd like to think that I've been promoted to professor partly in recognition of what can grow within an institution. I've been here, growing, actually in an employed capacity with a fractional post since 2008, which means I have grown with the institution. And before 2008, I was here doing a bit of part-time teaching. So I'd like to think that this professorship is partly in recognition of what can grow within an institution, sometimes at its edges, sometimes in the cracks in between, and sometimes despite the institution. But that growth, sometimes unseemly or even disquieting, happens only by working with or alongside others. And many of you are here tonight. In fact, many of those of you here tonight have really helped, whether you know that or not. Some of you might remember Cat's Cradle, the game from perhaps from your childhood, from playground, a loop of string that you put over your two hands and you pass to somebody else who then takes that string away from you, and it relies on the passing between for the game to work. I really like the way that this image is used by Donna Haraway. Donna Haraway, who has a more impressive professorial title than I do. She is Professor of Consciousness and Feminist Studies at the University of California, Berkeley. And she's an amazing thinker. She talks about the process of SF as string figuring, which is passing on and receiving, making and unmaking, picking up threads and dropping them, becoming with each other in surprising relays. I really like this idea of picking up and dropping threads in the sense of making mistakes or having to pick up something that got lost, that maybe you got distracted, got waylaid by something else, but later you can come back and pick it up. I like that idea. Because threads can get overtaken by process of thinking and doing, but they're still there to pick up later. And time is something that's important, that means that you can come back to something later. Listening is also important. And sometimes the best support comes just from listening. And there are many people I've bored by going on and on about Lyotard. On and on and on about Lyotard. But sometimes the best support comes from giving space. And I've got my family to thank for this. My parents have done more than their fair share of correcting and copy editing over the years, sometimes handing work back to me with a caveat of, I don't really understand it, but, and often that but is followed by a recommendation that the semicolon should be moved because you've no idea how to use semicolons, which may well be true. But also, I'd like to thank, I can't see, where's Jill? Yay! I'd like to thank Jill and her honesty, because it doesn't need her to roll her eyes anymore for me to know that it's time to stop talking. But she and all the family, they've given me space to work, to do this work, which is an absolute privilege. And just in case you haven't got an inkling yet of the fact that there is somewhat of an obsession around the work of Jean-François Lyotard for me, I thought I'd illustrate it in this way. This is the cover of my MA thesis from 1999, and this was an attempt to encourage my daughter's interest in philosophy from a young age. Whether it worked or not, you'll have to ask her later on. And then there's the delightful mug that I received on my 50th birthday, emblazoned with this picture of Lyotard sitting there in his garden drinking coffee. I'm not sure I agree with the title that was added to that. So I've talked a little bit about the direct and indirect support of friends, family, situations, and institutions. I'd like to add to that the experience of teaching students and working with many really fantastic colleagues. But before I go on, or maybe the segue into the second part, the Lyotard part, I'd also like to publicly acknowledge and celebrate another web, which is what I've found working either with philosophers like Lyotard or working on artists or performers, and that's interested parties who I've worked with directly. Sometimes these get overlooked, but translators, researchers, artists, rights holders who say yes, publishers. There's been a willingness and an openness to share and enter into debate, which I think is really important. And it may be too early in the events tonight to mention this, but when I've talked to other Lyotard scholars, we've agreed that there is something about his work, about the way that he writes, about the way that he thinks, that is seductive. And that is the word that has been used and nods have been made. And I think there is something about his work and his ideas that have seduced me to want to know more, to want to think more, to want to come back again and again. So here we are. Jean-François Lyotard, those are his dates. And I titled this as being aimed for beginners and skeptics alike, because I didn't want to put people off if you've never heard of him. Neither did I want to put people off if you've heard of him and didn't really like what you heard. But also I titled it this because I didn't want anybody to come who was an expert on Lyotard just to call me out, you know. If you're in the audience, you can do it afterwards, but not here. So if you've read the blurb that went along with the invitation, you'll know that Jean-François Lyotard is a French philosopher, and you'll know that it's nothing to do with gymwear. I'm sorry about this. This is floating around on the internet somewhere, and this is just for the benefit of those people who said, oh, are you going to wear a leotard? And I'm not. Lyotard wrote more than 30 books. He wrote books of philosophy. He wrote books on philosophy. He wrote books of essays. Essays on politics, on art, on literature, on film. And then I've got something in my notes to add here. Oh yes. Books which are dialogues with others. Books which are fictional dialogues responding to the work of artists. Essays in dialogue form with different voices where Lyotard is talking to himself but taking a different position. And he collaborated with artists on artist books, wrote books on single artists, wrote catalogue essays and essays on more than 30 contemporary artists. He made a small number of experimental films and videos and co-curated a landmark exhibition at the Pompidou Centre in 1985, co-curated. which was very much a group enterprise. And this is regarded as important in exhibition history, but generally when people write about Lyotard, and his ideas, this is sidelined, which is one reason why I wanted to put it at the centre of the short biography I wrote of him. But the three books that I recognise to be most important philosophically are these three up here. And I'm just going to run through the names just so that you can go away tonight having heard the titles at least. Discourse Figure was his thesis for the state doctorate, which I know I'm not going to say anything about it apart from it. Yeah? And he was 46 when he submitted that. It's in the general field of aesthetics, though he wouldn't agree with the term aesthetics. In its simplest form, it's about image and text and different ways of representing, different forms of representation. But as soon as he sets up these different forms of representation, he actually says that writing and discourse can't exist without aspects of the figural, and the image can't exist without aspects of discourse. So the two are imbricated. If you are looking at a piece of visual art, you're always surrounded by its framing, your presuppositions about it, the historical ideas around it. It's very difficult to only have that sensation. If I'm reading a piece of text, some would say that I'm simply decoding a set of symbols that have a meaning. Yes, but my eye is scanning that text. My eye is jumping. I'm touching the paper, or I'm reacting to the glare of a screen. My body is still here. My heart is still beating. I am still breathing. That is an aspect of the figural that seeps through into discourse. And then there's the interruptions, that maybe your mind wanders and something happens that you didn't expect to happen. Or maybe, just maybe, your stomach rumbles. Yeah? And it makes you aware that you are a physical body as well as the text.
I apologise.
It's okay. Fine. Maybe the cough starts as well. I wouldn't have looked round, but I thought it might be Mathieu who is going to leave, and he's warned me, so I'm going to spend until Mathieu leaves. Is Mathieu here? He's already left. Fine. Yeah. It slipped through my fingers. I was waiting for him to go. Yes, so that's discourse figure and the interrelationship of the two, and the fact that there might be something that erupts, that he calls the figural, that disturbs. And in many ways, what disturbed the kind of established forms of discourse in discourse figure went on overdrive in his next book, Libidinal Economy, which is an explosion of rhetoric, which is a great read. I mean, it really is a fantastic read, but he then disowned it as being ethically irresponsible. It's him really getting out of his system everything that he can't stand. And a lot of what he can't stand is what he used to stand. And this is him taking the mick. It's absolutely ripping into a certain set of Marxist beliefs that he used to hold, and coming from a position of real understanding and knowledge, because the thing that wasn't apparent in the 3 slides of books was what happened in the 50s and 60s before those books were published. All those 30-some books, 29 of them, well, bar one, they were all published in the 70s and 80s and 90s. In the 50s and 60s, he's a political activist. Not an armchair activist, a political activist who is discussing, writing, going out to the factory and agitating for 14 years. And I could go into that. And that would be a whole different lecture, but it would be remiss of me not to mention it, at least. So this is him kind of having an about turn to some extent, turning his back on some of his previous beliefs and losing loads of friends in the process. So So this is a real explosion. If you want a good read, read the opening section. It's really explicit, and if I was just teaching undergraduate students, I'd read some out just for the frisson of it, but I'm not going to do it now because it just seemed childish. In comparison, his next book and the next book in terms of book of philosophy, and regarded by him as his book of philosophy, seems in huge contrast. He says that he worked on it for the 10 years after libidinal economy. There were lots of other books, but they're fed into the differend. And the differend is deceptively slight. I liken it to drinking orange concentrate. You know that you're meant to water down with 10 parts water. If you sip, it is so intense. It needs time, and it needs the equivalent of water to actually let it wash over you and to allow you to untangle it. But it's about communication, and it's about the structures in which communication is formed. Didn't say that very well. It's not only linguistic communication, it's all forms of communication that he calls phrases. So famously, the twitch of a cat's tail is a phrase. Silence is a phrase, which becomes really important because by not responding to something, i.e. with silence, you are responding. And therefore, there's a real important ethical dimension to this book. So this is my pitch. Those are the three recognised books. This is the one that was published posthumously, put together by his widow. It hasn't been translated as a whole. Misère de la philosophie translates as The Poverty of Philosophy. A lot of the separate essays within it have been translated. Somebody is working on the translation at the moment, and he talked about some of the essays in here as being the second volume of the differend, and it's really good stuff. One reason I'm mentioning this is that one of the essays in here I'll reference later in the lecture. Okay. So despite the fact that I've bigged up those three books and their importance philosophically, most people know Lyotard because of the postmodern and because of this one book, The Postmodern Condition. So this one book and this one topic has dominated his reception. Lyotard is still best known for The Postmodern Condition, which was written in 1989 and translated in 1984. And with that, his contribution to the postmodern debate. I don't want to say a lot about this, except that his use of the term postmodern is different from the usual one. Usually it's talked about in terms of a periodization. And yes, it was the wrong term to use because post means after. So the discussion is that it's after the modern, but that isn't how he was using it. Neither is it anything to do with what in art history or design history or architectural history is termed postmodernism. The art, design and architecture of the 70s, 80s and 90s isn't what he's talking about. Okay, so those are kind of the two fallacies that I want to just clear that up there. Postmodern Condition started life as a commissioned report. He was commissioned to write a report on the state of knowledge in the most advanced, economically, industrially advanced countries at that time. He was commissioned by the Council of Universities of Quebec, the semi-autonomous region of Canada. And weirdly, and I don't know how this happened, but it happened very fast, this report then got published by an academic publisher. And from an academic point of view, it sold like wild. Yeah? I mean, it really did. It took off. I mean, we're not talking bestsellers list in terms of, equivalent of novels, but it sold really well, and it left him a little bit baffled and drew him into this debate that was raging. But this commission to write this report on knowledge in the most industrially developed countries led him to write about a condition which he termed postmodern, a shift in the way that knowledge gains legitimacy, highlighting a drive towards efficiency in knowledge production, guided by a criterion of performativity. And let me just be really clear here. This isn't what he was advocating. This was him looking round at the countries which then were called the West and looking at what's happening to knowledge. And he was observing that it has become driven by this aspect of performativity. Performativity means maximum output for minimum input, which will sound familiar to you in many contexts. He tied it to an increased computerization and the packaging of data for efficient transmission. And aspects of it now still sound prescient. And I'll just say a little quote. The question, overt or implied, now asked by the professionalist student, the state or institutions of higher education, is no longer, is it true, but what use is it? This is 1979. There is a positive note here in that he writes of the importance of that which doesn't fit. That which doesn't fit the system, that which doesn't fit the parameters, that which doesn't fit the logic. And there's an echo here of what I tried to describe of the figural, that which is unseen. And he ends this report by talking about the fact that we still have a desire for justice and we still have a desire for the unknown. Yeah, and for me, I think that is a positive. Okay. He later published a couple of collections with postmodern in the title. I'm highlighting this just to say that he stayed with the debate, sometimes clarifying his position, but also changing his position as well. And this is very typical of Lyotard, and it's really annoying in that he's always shifting his position. He isn't a philosopher who has set concepts, and it's not a case of you can go to him for a concept and use it, because that concept is always being reworked and he's always rethinking. And really, they're always a provocation to think and a provocation to do rather than to use. Yeah? So he's always slippery. Lyotard's reaction to being sucked into the postmodern debate, I think, was kind of bemused, one of bemusement. Yes, it meant that he got international fame, fantastic. But it also meant that his other work was overlooked. And it meant that as the legacy, that his legacy to some extent has been tied with that of postmodernism. And so as interest in postmodernism has waned, interest in Lyotard has waned. To really a really low level. Which means that it's relatively easy for me to step in there, because there's not a lot of Lyotard scholars out there. Yeah, it doesn't take a lot to. Yeah, so if you're looking for a little, I'd encourage it. It's a good career move. It really is. But I mean, seriously, it has opened the fact he's not fashionable. The fact that he started, he was already not fashionable when I started my MA in 1998. Yeah, and it really has not been an upward curve for him since then. But it's meant that I have had many opportunities. So in 2015, Reaction Books approached me to write a short biography of Lyotard. I was still relatively junior in academic terms. It was only 5 years after my PhD. In itself, that's not unusual. The Critical Life series is a series of short illustrated biographies, 45,000 words long, so about half in a normal academic book. often what happens is that an early career researcher, as I was, would be commissioned to write a book on a well-known author or philosopher or thinker or maybe an artist, and they would be able to draw on existing biographies, proper biographies, full biographies, propose a new viewpoint, draw a synthesis together and write a short biography. Admittedly, there are some fantastic authors in the series as well who are really well-established biographers who've already written biographies of 250,000 words, and they kind of like do a summary for this series. But for Lyotard, having received this rather flattering invitation, I very soon realised that there was no written biography of Lyotard on which to draw. And so I put together a proposal which was more about his work, and they came back and said, "Where's the life? Where's the life? It's life and work." So I had to go back to the drawing board, and I had to go to the archive, and I had to start contacting people who knew him, and most importantly, start talking to his family in order to fashion together something which was a life and work, short life and work of Lyotard, which is how I referred to it in all my emails to people. It's not a biography, it's a short life and work. Now I admit it is a biography of sorts, but the reason I was so hesitant is that Lyotard himself had a real problem with biography. In interviews, when interviewers ask him about his life, he tends to say, "Ooh, no, that's biography, no." And the reason is that the genre of biography quite often leads somebody's work to be read through their life. The biography is seen as a key to understanding the work and therefore reducing the work. And that's absolutely the antithesis of what Lyotard wanted. He also didn't believe that the work was only about him. And actually, it was separate from him because he was changing all the time. And the work was changing all the time. So I had to overcome this kind of dilemma. The answer to some extent was the fact that he himself, he had written a biography. One of the last books to be published by Lyotard was a biography. So there you are, you're saying you don't like biographies, you don't want to talk about yourself, but you've written a book about no less than André Malraux, the novelist, the writer on art, the collector of art, the thief of art, we won't go into that, the adventurer, the minister of culture under de Gaulle. Some of you might be aware of him for this term, the imaginary museum, because he said that photography allows you to create your own museum, allows you to photograph a plethora of different works from different periods, from different countries, and put them together and photograph them and crop them and create something that is your own and very different. Why did Lyotard feel it was all right to write a biography of Malraux? Well, in some ways, he was given permission by Malraux himself, because Malraux had already written an autobiography that was an anti-autobiography called the Anti-Memoirs. He had already made things up about himself. He'd already written novels which actually were reinterpretations and fictionalizations of his life. Yeah, so this is already happening. This man's life is already a legend, is already a series of myths. Yeah, and so it's okay to tap into that. And so what Lyotard writes isn't a straight biography, not a proper biography as he referred to other proper biographies of Malraux, but a hypobiography. Hypo as in hypothetical. It could have happened like this. Yeah, so it opens through the eyes of a 16-month-old Malraux. Get an idea? Yeah, nobody knows what the 16-month-old Malraux was thinking, but that's how he's writing it. In terms of bios, life, from biography, one of the themes that Lyotard identifies in Malraux's writings is the larvae, insects, arachnids, the life which lives with underneath, or ultimately on our human life. You could almost go back to that quote from Haraway about the interconnected responsibility of species. But here, this is less about a celebration and more an abject recoiling from. Malraux's creatures are the stuff of nightmares, yet teeming with life all the same. For Lyotard, the attraction to the unseemly is because it falls outside the constructed cocoons that protect us from the inopportune, the unseemly, and that which is even disquieting. And this is the one quote that I'm happy for you to take away tonight. If you get anything from this lecture, this one quote, I hope, is the one that can stay with you. And this quote comes from an essay called The Affect Phrase, which is in that book I mentioned that was down here a few slides ago, The Poverty of Philosophy. And the reason that I've included this particular quote in the title of the lecture tonight is because this is an essay that we read together in a reading group that I helped convene called the Slow Research Reading Group. And it's slow because there's no preparatory reading. We just get together, and that's postgraduate research students, that's research members of staff, people that are interested in research. We come together on a fortnightly basis and we read in the session. So there's no preparatory reading. We read slowly in the session. It could be sometimes that we only get through a page in an hour and a half, because we're talking about what it makes us think in relation to what we're making, what we're researching, what we're thinking about. Sometimes it's just what bumps into our heads, and digressions are good. And there's a lot of that takes place. And I think it's a really important space. But I must admit, I was nervous when we chose to do this as a text, because I thought, I should know all this. You know, I'm meant to be the Lyotard guy. I really should know this already. But that's not what it's about. The session's not about showing off your knowledge. It's about reacting to the text in the moment and the reactions of others in the moment. And I found it incredibly useful. And the one thing that emerged for many of us there was that we found an attraction to this phrase that Ian picked out and actually printed out and stuck on our water boiler in the office at one point. This phrase of inopportune, unseemly, and even disquieting. I think that we liked the idea that there's something which bubbles up unexpectedly when you're making work, when you're teaching, when you're responding to work. And it's that we found attractive. We were also at the time very conscious that it's something that many students found really difficult, because it's the antithesis of what they wanted. They wanted certainty. They wanted to know what was going to be useful and how it was going to be useful. Yeah? I'm going to look back to Polytechnic quickly. And this idea of Polytechnicity. And I'm sorry, I know it's hot in here. Feel free to fan. Fan away. Lyotard was a philosopher. He taught philosophy, he studied philosophy. But one of the reasons why I'm attracted to him and his ideas and his way of thinking is that he reached out into other areas, never thinking that he could properly belong in those areas, neither overly respecting those who worked in those areas, and certainly not respecting the frames or the histories of those areas. What he did respect and what he reacted to was the material at hand and the matter at hand, whether it was using art, writing, filmmaking, or exhibition making. As I say, there was a respect for the material and for the matter, not for the conventions or historical framing. And I think this comes from a particular context of his teaching. which, at the particular context of his teaching at the Experimental University Centre Vincennes in Paris, which opened almost at the same time as the Polytechnic here. This actually opened in 69, we opened in 70, but 1970 is when Lyotard started teaching there in the philosophy department, and he taught there from 1970 to the end of his career in France, which was 1987. It was an unusual place. Vincennes became Paris 8, Paris 8. It was unusual because it took students regardless of their prior qualifications. So you had students that hadn't passed the baccalaureate that could go and enrol at university. It scheduled classes in the evening and at the weekend so that workers could attend classes. It had a creche, which meant that young parents could attend clashes, those ones, yeah? Lots of students from overseas attended, particularly from South America, as it happened. Also, it wasn't just philosophy students. In a class, you'd have students from art, from filmmaking, from sociology, all mixed together. Can you imagine that? So you had no idea what the students' previous knowledge was. You just got to assume that they were all massively different. And on top of that, there's no hierarchy of courses. There's no progression. There's no aesthetics 1 followed by aesthetics 2. You can't do aesthetics 3 until you've done aesthetics 2. It's one level and everybody's together. Yeah? Which means that the difficult thinkers who previously were only for master's students can't have any of that. It's all together. And they were learning all together in a very different way to the way that we are, or I am presenting tonight. They only had one lecture theatre in the whole of the university when it opened. It was flat level. I don't want to sound nostalgic for it. It's just, there's just something about that situation that I think is important in the way that he went about his thinking. Because it was about a process of negotiation and dialogue, a working out together. He talks about his experience of teaching in an interview that I published in the most recent collection. And there's this interview with a little-known art magazine, and the interviewer asks him, can you conceive of a communication volontaire? Which I work with, I'm very lucky, I work with a translator who was a former student of Lyotard's, not at Vincennes, but before that at Nanterre. And I made the mistake of thinking I could translate this 6,000-word interview with Lyotard. And then realised that I'd bitten off more than I can chew, sent it to Roger McKeon, this translator, and he very helpfully pointed out my mistakes. And this was one where there was emails go backwards and forwards. And I think that Roger was saying voluntary communication. I said, I like self-directed because it makes me think of self-directed education. And anyway, I don't know what voluntary communication means. But now it's been published as self-directed communication. I'm thinking, actually, there's something about the voluntarism in volontaire that carries across into voluntary communication. And okay, it may not have any meaning, but it has a poetic resonance because it makes me think, who's doing the volunteering? What's doing the volunteering? Why is it being volunteered? What's being offered up? Self-directed doesn't quite convey the idea of something beyond the self driving the communication, going beyond well-articulated, well-conceived discourse. As Lyotard said in the affect phrase, is feeling a phrase? How can a feeling communicate? And this is key to why I'm drawn to his work, as there's a listening out for, a paying attention to that which isn't expected. There's something intensely challenging about Lyotard's approach, which is a refusal of the already said, the déjà dit. It's quite simplistic as a mantra. Don't say what's already been said, don't repeat what's already gone before, but actually it's profoundly difficult to live up to. So when Lyotard is reading Malraux, reading the philosopher Kant, reading Freud, writing on Duchamp, on the filmmaker Michael Snow, on one of the 30 or so artists that he wrote on, whose work he responded to rather, he's always listening to the work for that which has not been made explicit. Listening to that which is under the skin of assumptions, aside from the biographical and art historical. Paying attention to the work and its thought. Paying attention to the manner of the thinking. And this perhaps helps us to appreciate how disciplined the communication volontaire is, and what a responsibility it is to be given the floor. And this is the point where I'm giving you the floor, and I would like you all to have one of these. Tim, my lovely assistant, is going to start from the back, and here, if you could take one and pass them on, please. Now, I'm sorry in advance. I'm just sorry in advance, but because it's hot in here. What I would like you to do, I'd like you to have the piece of paper in front of you with the blank side up. Okay. And when I tell you, wait for it, when I tell you, I would, and this is why I'm sorry, because I know that we're all really sweaty, but you know, there was a time when deodorant didn't exist. But I'm going to ask you to lift, when I tell you, to lift this up to kind of that level. Yeah? And just look left and look right and try and have it at the same level as the people to the left and right of you. Yeah? That's good. Okay. Now I'd like you to shut your eyes. And can you breathe in through your nose for 3 and out through your mouth for 4? So in through your nose. 1, 2, 3, and out through your mouth. Breathe in again. And out. And at the risk of you going to sleep, one last time. And out. Open your eyes and look left and look right. This is the skin of the sky. This is the canopy that Lyotard-Augustine described as being the separation, the skin of writing, the book which enfolds us. But skin has holes, it has pores, and as you put it down, you'll realise that it's not an impenetrable skin, but it's a permeable skin. Some of you have page 1, which is titled Blason. Those of you who've got page 2 and 3 won't have that title, so it's B-L-A-S-O-N, Blason. Blason's a type of poetry that was popular in the 15th and 16th centuries, which celebrated the attributes of your lover. Didn't celebrate the whole of your lover, just celebrated particular aspects. And I'd like you to roll up your piece of paper on the short edge. Because Lyotard-Augustine asks us in Blason to focus on the 5 senses, starting with our right ear, or our oreille, les yeux, la narine. Really, really smell that. There's some good photocopy ink in there. La bouche. But this is really taste. So what I want you to do is I want you to blow and then suck. And just run your tongue around your teeth. You can taste yourself, can't you? Take your finger, I'm not sure what this one is called, this finger, and touch the back of your neck. Very, very gently. Run it across the back of your neck. And just in case we have not done enough, go around your ear as well. So we've got sight, sound, smell, taste, and touch in separate elements of the body that Lyotard draws attention to when he writes with Augustine. Saint Augustine of Hippo. Augustine, who was born in North Africa, in Algeria. Augustine, who lived in the 4th, 5th centuries. Augustine, who is a canonical figure for the Catholic Church, particularly in France. Augustine, who is an important philosopher in the Western tradition. Augustine, on whom Lyotard was writing when he died at the age of 73 from leukemia. Lyotard's book was published incomplete. The first essay had been worked to its fruition. The second was to be worked. The rest is fragments. It's published as the Confession of Augustine, and it's in dialogue with St. Augustine's Confessions. Augustine was also famous for mentioning that his mentor Ambrose read silently, which makes us realise that it was the norm at the time for people to read out loud. Malraux's anti-memoirs was a weaving of fictions exploited by Lyotard in his retellings, observations, commentary, admonitions, as well as admiration. His writing on Confessions is again returned to biography. Confessions is selective, but famously, this is Augustine's Confessions, recounts an inner monologue or dialogue with God. Lyotard's work dialogues with Augustine. So it's Augustine, it's Lyotard dialoguing with Augustine, who's dialoguing with himself and dialoguing with God. There's a lot of voices in there. Lyotard takes huge chunks from Confessions, but reorders them. And he doesn't use quote marks. Plagiarism alert. I mean, could you imagine what Turnitin would make of this? So it means that when you're reading it, it's not clear who is which. The English translation by Richard Beardsworth, who teaches across the road at the University of Leeds, I have fallen in love with. But very recently, and this is literally in the last week, I read something by a French scholar that confirmed something that I'd suspected for a while, is that Beardsworth's translation, which was often done quite quickly, he borrows somebody else's translation of Augustine. And this translation that he uses has a very churchy voice, and it's thee and thou, which means when you read it, you can sign a C when Augustine becomes Lyotard, when Lyotard becomes Augustine. Okay, and in the French that doesn't happen, which is a shame. So I've twiddled a little bit with the translation. I've kept Beardsworth's bits of Lyotard, but retranslated Lyotard's translation of the original because he was working from the Latin. So it's already his translation. You call, you cry, you have broken my deafness. You sparkle, you shine, you have banished my blindness. You spread your scent, I breathe it in and pant after you. I have tasted you in my mouth, and now I hunger and thirst after you. You touch my skin, and I burn with ardour for your peace. Here, in the middle of Book 10, We have been hearing him complain. He has been listening to himself groan, has continued to moan, has apologised, has accused himself for being late, for always being behind you, for being delay in person, for never being on time for the encounter with you. He's been accusing you a little. You left me by the wayside. Why did you abandon me? The late one's lamentation, confessing their distraction. They beg to be given another chance. Oh, thou beauty, how late I came to love thee, so ancient and so new. So late came I to love you. But still, I see you were with me when I was without, searching for you among the things that you have so graciously made. I rushed at them, rushed there to my disgrace. You were within me, and I was not. They kept me away from you, these things which would not even be if they were not within you. Infatuated with earthly delights, wallowing in the poverty of satisfaction, the I was sitting idle, smug, like a becalmed boat in a null agitation. Then, but when, you sweep down upon him and force entrance through his 5 estuaries, a destructive wind, a typhoon. You draw the closed lips of the flat sea towards you. You open them and turn them, unfurling inside out. Thus the lover excites the 5 mouths of the woman, swells her vowels, those of ear, of eye, of nose, and of tongue, and skin that stridulates. At present, he is consumed by your fire, impatient for the return to peace that your 5-fold ferocity brings him. Your eye laid in wait for us, he protests. It pierced the lattice of our flesh. You caressed us with your voice. We hasten on your scent like lost Saluki hounds. You carry him away. Open-mouthed, he gapes at your beatitude. You took him like a woman, cut him through, opened, turned him inside out. Placing your outside within, you converted the most intimate part of him into his outside. And with this exteriority to himself, yours, an incision henceforth from within, you make your saint of saints. Penetrale meum, he confesses, thy shrine in me. Thank you.